Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the What Movement podcast for entrepreneurs, business people, anyone that's out there making it happen. A series called Navigating the Fog, which is really diving into the current situation we find ourselves in and helping people thrive on the other side. So I'm bringing in guests that are experts in this area. They're either independent media, medical experts, law experts, politicians, you name it, influencers. And today we have a very special guest. His name's Astin-Gregory, who's got arguably one of the biggest podcasts in the world in this space. It's actually called the Pandemic Podcast. He's had over 8 million views. He's had all the biggest influencers in the world jump on his show. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But he's an entrepreneur. He's an activist, and he's involved with a few other projects as well to really help us thrive on the other side. So we're going to talk about all of that. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Pleasure to be here, Craig. Absolute honor, and looking forward to speaking with you.
Great. And I always like to invite each guest to just, I do an introduction, but don't often do it justice. So if you can just fill in the gap, share a bit more of your story and where we are today, and then we'll take it from there.
Well, very whistle-stop tour, to give some context to where we are today. Like many people, we've been affected by this pandemic in different ways, and I didn't grow up wanting to comment on, to create content on pandemics and whatnot. But after 8 years in corporate, I started my own business in 2012. Really wanted to follow the path of entrepreneurship. And over the last decade, I've spent my time outside of this, working with startup founders to take their ideas, turn them to reality. Transform into reality rather, and help develop strategies for growing and scaling their enterprises. But lo and behold, with big plans coming into 2020, like many of us entrepreneurs, we kind of map out our year, but break down our 90-day plans. Very quickly, things began to change. My wife and I had got married in 2019. We went on our honeymoon in February 2020, and at the point of going to our honeymoon, we were flying out to Asia. We were going to go to Thailand for our break, and the ripples of COVID-19 had started to make their ways to the radio waves and the news over here in the UK at that point, and nothing like we've endured since that point, but in terms of the intensity. But I did my due diligence. I thought, if I'm going to fly out there, whilst we're not flying out to China, neighboring countries, are we going to be putting ourselves at risk? And very quickly, I looked at a lot of the data from the early data from China. I looked at some of the early papers that had come out, and I made an assessment that this was a respiratory flu-like virus that predominantly is going to be impacting the elderly, those with significant comorbidities. At that point, it's very clear the mortality rate was predominantly affecting elderly, obese, those with 3 or 4 other serious illnesses. So I thought, well, it's my wife and I aren't going to be putting ourselves at risk. Let's go on holiday. And so we had our 2 weeks in beautiful Thailand, celebrating our marriage, and then came back. And within a week, like that, the UK went into its first lockdown. And we heard the story, 3 weeks to flatten the curve. I think a lot of people bought into that story. It's a case of, myself included, the NHS needs to prepare itself for this onslaught. And this 3 weeks will give us time to get the supplies we need and get everyone ready. And everyone thought, fair enough. As things progressed, of course, that never-ending story, very quickly it started to seem like something else was happening, and it led to me basically obsessively. I like many entrepreneurs, driven by curiosity more than anything else, want to understand the world and how things work. So I spent a lot of time. I'm a speed reader. I read very quickly, read hundreds of articles, got my head around a lot of the science and the data, started making connections with people I knew in the scientific world, just to try and make sense of this and say, why are we following this policy? You look at the pandemic rule books from prior to 2020, and none of them would ever endorse, let alone entertain the idea of a lockdown, putting people under house arrest. None of these things have been considered. Well, they have been considered, but they've always been ruled out. So why are we doing this? What's different? And no matter where I looked, there was nothing that told us that that there was any grounds for this type of activity. And what started to happen was that there was clearly no evidence for any kind of cost-benefit analysis for any of these policies. And very quickly, we started to see the harm stacking up from all these policies. So I became obsessed with understanding the science, the data, and just really tracking what was going on. And I did so kind of silently in the background for a long period of time. But then I just reached a point of leverage later in the year where I started to see some really damning pictures from across the world about how children were being impacted. Because at this time, my wife and I were thinking about starting a family. And Craig, to be honest with you, when I saw some of these images of kids literally in Perspex boxes in schools, I broke down. I thought, what are we doing? Because one of my highest values in business has always been integrity. And over that period of 9 months that led up to me prior to start the podcast, I just felt my integrity was being violated by these politicians, by these decision makers. And when I saw this happening to the children, it was enough is enough. Once you start harming the young people at scale, then I felt duty bound to do something. So lo and behold, started the podcast, and here we are, unbelievably, still over 12 months on from that point, and still going, unbelievably.
Yeah, we're going to talk a bit about your podcast, so it's a good starting point for us. But I have a very similar story back in January 2020. I'm typically 20 weeks a year traveling around the world, and I was all mapped and ready to go. I was actually doing a tour of China, then India, then the Philippines, then going into Europe, and then into Africa, and they were all paid for, all set up, ready to go. And one by one, each trip was getting cancelled, and I cancelled the China one because it's only going to be a couple of 100 kilometers from Wuhan, but it was still just a situation really in Greater China at that point in time. And then we moved into March, and it's 2 days out. It's like Philippines have shut their country borders. Okay, I can't go there. I'm just about to go to India. India shut their country borders, and not long after that, Australia did, and here we are. But yeah, I did curiosity sort of got to me as well. I have sort of been following this story. Probably I track back to as far back as 2007. So I wasn't quite surprised with what I found quite early on. And I did start interviewing people in conjunction with my usual podcast, which is really about inspiration and education to help people thrive in life. So I've sort of like just had a bit of a special series and spin on it as well, because it's really important. You don't find this information out on the mainstream news. So you've got to bring this information to the people. So I'm glad we're going to be able to spend some time with you. So, well, let's talk about the Pandemic podcast. You've had a lot of guests. I think you mentioned you've had 300 episodes. Correct me if I'm right, over 8 million views. But when you interview people too, you learn a lot yourself. So you've interviewed some of the Rainer Fulmichers, who's running incredible law cases internationally. You're talking, I might not pronounce the name, Matthias in mental health. So I want you to just talk a bit about your vision for the podcast, and let's just talk about that.
Well, again, like many entrepreneurs, you almost have to go to the backstory to tell the present. But very briefly, like yourself, Craig, very similarly, in fact, for the last decade, I'd created a podcast called the Unstoppable Podcast, which is really about looking at human behavior, understanding we can optimize our own leadership, become our best versions of ourselves. That's really at the core of what I'm passionate about doing, is untapping and unlocking potential and elevating humanity. Hence the name of my company, Elevate Media, elevate humanity and enrich the world. And in fact, when I came back to the first lockdown, the first thing I did was I'm going to use my skills and knowledge to help other people get through this. So I launched something called Elevate Live. It actually went on to become a world record-breaking online summit. Effectively, we ran for 45 days. We did 3 to 5 live interviews every single day with people in health, wellness, money, business, spirituality, really to try and keep people engaged and uplifted during this period of lockdown. But the more and more I went through this, I was, as I was saying, studying all the data, and I thought, I need to be commenting. I need to be speaking out about what I'm seeing. And I would go on these dates, like yourself, had a 1 hour walk that we could go. I'd go on these 1 hour walks, and my poor wife, who just had it in her ear the whole time. All these things I was learning and witnessing around the world. But at that point, when you started putting stuff online, you started putting anything that questioned the narrative, you'd get shut down, insulted, and you still do. There's some, not so many. But it reached a point, Craig, where I just said, I have to find a way to share what I'm learning. So with that in mind, I felt I had to record a video. I didn't have a plan for a podcast at the beginning. I just wanted to record a short video sharing what I observed. And it took a lot of courage to do that, because again, I was thinking about, what are my friends and family going to think? What are my business associates going to think? What are my clients going to think? All of these fears were coming up, because at that point it was still, it was like dark matter to go into this world where you question the narrative. There's something wrong with you. But nonetheless, I was out for a walk and the sun was shining, and it was just like this moment of insight where it's like, if you do not step up now and say your piece, you'll never, when will you ever lead? Because I felt like I'd had lots of times in my business career where these moments have come where it felt like I had to do something different in order to make a difference. And this was that one of those guiding moments. So the very next day I woke up and I thought, right, today's the day I'm going to speak out. And I just did it on my mobile phone. I just picked up my phone. I didn't have my kit. I've got all the podcast gear. I just picked up my phone. And even in the moments before I pressed live, my heart was beating and I was thinking, what people think? I thought, too late, live. Off I went. And I just spoke for 20 minutes from the heart. I'd been thinking about what I wanted to say. But it's unbelievable that I saw the viewer count in the corner just ticking up, 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 up. And bear in mind, I ran this 45-day long summit, which reached 100,000 people. And I was just seeing this going to the hundreds and the thousands. I deliberately tried to get the last content to go viral. And this thing, just in this 20-minute video, is ticking up. For whatever I was saying, struck a chord and resonated with people, because at that point there was so little people speaking out about what was going on that I think what it triggered in people was like, well, actually I feel that way, but I feel uncomfortable saying it. This guy is saying exactly what I feel. And that first video went on to reach something like 300,000 views within 2 or 3 days. It just went completely viral. It was like 7,000 shares within a few days. And all the comments were really favorable, most of them. And it just gave me faith, that encouragement that I wasn't alone in thinking this way. So I thought, right, what can I do? I've got to continue this momentum. I want to continue speaking out about what I'm seeing. I want to be sharing what I'm learning. So a month later, I launched the Pandemic podcast, with the goal of simply telling the story that the world seems unwilling, asking the questions the world seems willing to ask, and telling the untold story of the pandemic, but to do so in a really credible way, where I'm bringing on, esteemed scientists, guests who can actually make sense of this, and to try and communicate with kind of mainstream society what is going on in the world. Does it make sense, and is there an alternative perspective here, and how do we navigate this? And I started a daily show back in October 2020, and it's been daily ever since. Over 300 episodes, sometimes multiple times a day, if there's current affairs, if there's stuff happening in Parliament or whatnot. Stacks of different guests, really trying to sense make around what's happening. And I've tried to do it in an unbiased way. It's very hard, because you've got this weight of counter narrative. It becomes a counter narrative to this huge narrative. But I have brought guests on that are contrarian to my own views, just to try and get a depth of perspective. They often go down like, when you've accumulated an audience that see the world the way you do, you bring on someone else, it goes down like a lead balloon. But for me, it's about trying to, rather than just become an opposing voice, it's trying to understand from all perspectives what's really happening here. How do we navigate this, and what can we learn from this, and how do we move forward? And it's been a transformational experience, Craig, in many ways. It's transformed my character. This term activist, I'd never been to a political rally before. I'd never been to a protest. There's things politically that I'd become passionate about in the past, but never like this. Now I'm attending protests. I'm an integral part of the kind of resistance movement here in the UK, trying to challenge these policies, getting involved with things like the Together Declaration behind me. So it's gone beyond the content. It's gone beyond the content now to how do we actually create change. But I'm sure, like the same you're discovering with your show, Craig, the more you dig, the deeper you dig, you get to the core of what's really happening here. And it's a reflection of the systems of the world, and the way that the world works, that this is manifesting in the way that it has. And it's very difficult for people to see that. We can talk about the surface level science and the data, but it's the drivers underneath it that have become more and more fascinating for me. And that's really where I'm placing my attention going forward, and how we can understand the kind of the mechanics of what's happening here, the levers that are being pulled in order to drive the pandemic response forward, even to this day.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good point at the start of that as well, where you do, I guess, take the mask off for the first time, and you do come out of your comfort zone. And so many people say to me, Craig, I want to say what you say, but I don't have the courage to do it. But I believe everything you do, and I'm right behind everything you do. But your circles around you, you divide them. And very much like you, I did it tough going through the global financial crisis, and I made a decision then that I wasn't going to be controlled by the government again. So I got myself out of the matrix over the last 12 years, but I didn't factor in a lockdown. So I didn't quite master it, but that's where we're at. I wouldn't mind diving into a bit about the mechanics as well, but just want to touch on a couple of guests. I'm really fascinated. You said one of your most watched shows was around, I think, the impact it has on people. That guest, Matthias.
Matthias Desmet, yeah.
Yeah, can you just touch a little bit on that for the audience so they can get some context about what you were telling me?
Yeah, so it's I'd seen his content through his part of the Corona investigation with Rainer Fulnick. And what he specializes in is he's a professional psychologist, but he also studied the history of authoritarianism and what leads to what are some of the precursors that lead to authoritarian behavior, what leads to public compliance, what leads to people. For want of a better phrase, buying into a narrative, what prevents some certain pockets of society from questioning what's going on. And this for me was a really impactful interview for a number of levels. On the first basis, it kind of takes that kind of helicopter view on what's happening, because up until this point, when you're getting into the weeds of the data or the science behind PCR tests and all these other different components, they could still, even if it's pure fact, it can be quite divisive in terms of the content. And I don't like the term pure fact, by the way. I'm going to blur that one out, because that's part of the problem we've seen in the last 12 months, 18 months, is that the science rules, and the science is rarely settled. So, but there are things we can observe. But nonetheless, what we did with Matthias is took this kind of helicopter view on what's happening. And I think what that led to was more and more people looking at the situation objectively and recognizing, well, okay, well, let's put the medical science aside. Let's look at the social science here, the cultural science of understanding human behavior amongst all of this, and some of the pieces, the components that lead to this type of behavior politically, but then also the compliance side on the flip side of this. And I think what it did is it provided a mirror to people so they could see that their own role in this this pandemic response and how they were enabling to some degree some of the things we were witnessing. He talked about some of the things such as background anxiety, as in within public, we live at highly stressful lives now. People working long hours, people, the high level of intensity. So what happens in something like this when there's an external crisis is, rather than having to confront their own anxieties and neurosis, all the problems they've got in their own lives, they can then attach that anxiety to an external source through the pandemic, through the virus. So that's why you get a lot of people kind of, almost holding on to this story themselves, because it gives them comfort, because they don't have to look at their own internal anxieties. And he talked about 4 or 5 different factors that lead to this type of behavior, and very, 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 very insightful guy. And he talks about how the rise of authoritarian behaviours commence. There's links really to some of the stuff that's been done by the likes of Professor Zimbardo in the past, which looks at how people's leadership behaviours operate under crisis. I don't know if you've seen that work, but it's the Stanford Prison Experiment is an example of that. But all these psychological principles that he laid out in that hour-long interview just make real sense to people, and it's sort of one of those videos that's just been shared and shared and shared, because it just helps people to understand some of the mechanics about what's going on outside of all the kind of heated debate around the virus and the political measures.
Yeah, I sort of, one of my first interviews I did was with a guy that specialized in the subconscious mind and how that works, and how I tried to start back in April, May last year, was doing interviews which were not too confrontational, but they were sort of like giving people an understanding of how the TV controls your mind, how your environment, the people you spend time with, control your behaviors and what you can do as well. And you see the pressure in the community of people going along to get along with going to get the experiment, for example, because everyone else is. And
Mm.
we all, the TV and the stories about, hey, we're all going to get our freedoms back if we're all diving into that. It was quite fascinating. But then I was able to like position that then into the story a little bit more, because back in May last year, there was still, most things were still very much labeled a conspiracy. Whereas now, if someone says that to me now, I just say, hey, that was May 2020 type of conversation. It's all in black and white. It's all, it's in stone effectively now. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's just move with the times. And that brings me to, you mentioned about you're really fascinated about the mechanics now. When you say that, are you referring to things like the World Economic Forum agendas? Can you just dive into that a little bit? Because people really do need to know this.
Yeah, and I've been, and to be quite frank, I've been trying to drip feed this information into my podcast, because you can go from studying the pandemic data. People can get their head around that. It's on the TVs, it's in the newspapers every single day. But what's not in the newspapers, what's not in the media, is the kind of the political. When I was studying economics, we called it a pestle analysis, looking at the politics, the economics, the societal factors, technological factors, legal factors, environmental factors. But all of these things are really at play here. And you mentioned the World Economic Forum, which, for those of you who aren't aware, they are a collection of people call it global elites. I try and avoid these terms because they're so blanket, but it's essentially major corporation leaders of some of the biggest companies in the world coming together to kind of influence the direction of life as we know it. And the World Economic Forum, if you track their history for the last 30 odd years, they've been driving this model of the stakeholder capital, which is about looking at how private companies can play a greater role in influencing public policy, government policy, effectively. And linked to this, there's a fantastic book that I've recently read called Winners Take All by his name's just lost. I've lost his name now, but I'll come back to that. But he examines in his book this role of what I call philanthro-capitalists. It's very wealthy individuals who use their money and influence to shape public policy. And just as a simple example, we're talking about the kind of the experiment as you reference it. I think we have to be careful about what we say on social media these days, using the V word, because you might get censored. But here, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, for instance, again, massive companies, very influential leaders. Many of them are part of these kind of networks like the World Economic Forum. If you look at the Q1 2021 around the world, look at how much money, record amounts of money, has been spent on political lobbying in the first 90 days of the year. So I tell this because the World Economic Forum is essentially a centralized body which has a huge amount of power when it comes to influencing the trajectory of the world that we follow. They talk about the fourth industrial revolution. And again, I'm someone who's come from a world of economics. I studied economics at university, economic history. And, it makes sense to talk in those terms, first, second, third, fourth industrial revolution. But the difference here is if you study economics from a historical point of view, you're looking back at the journey that we've been on. Whereas the World Economic Forum are very forward focused. And this is where it's important, because the World Economic Forum and their members do have a vision for the world that they would like to bring forward. And within all of that, there is some good things, don't get me wrong. But as someone who's an entrepreneur, as an innovator myself, I'm a big fan of innovation. But what we're seeing with the World Economic Forum is this. I think on the first hand, what we're seeing with the kind of this pharmaceutical intervention level, we're seeing the fact that the natural immunity is being dismissed, and we're seeing this promotion, mass promotion of a pharmaceutical intervention is the first example of something where I think is indicative of one of the philosophies of the World Economic Forum, who are linked to Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance, and various other alliances of that nature. But again, they're all circles of the same players, the same kind of heavy hitters in terms of money and power. And what these organizations are able to do is have enormous influence on how governments run. So when we're seeing things like this mass vaccination rollout, people can get their head around, putting out a product that could help the most vulnerable. We talked at the beginning of the interview about this small proportion of society that's significantly at risk. You can make an argument for that. But when you start trying to immunize every living soul, that becomes an ideology. And that's an example of one of the ideologies, I believe, that has been driven forward by the likes of the World Economic Forum. The fact that you're diminishing natural immunity and prioritizing a pharmaceutical intervention. I think it's a sign of the times, Craig, and I think it's a sign of where we're going, where these types of organizations want things to go. And that's just one example, because, of course, I mentioned PESTLE, this political, economic, social, this kind of technocratic view of where the world goes. I've just been reading some really interesting industry papers on digital identification, for instance, reading industry information on transhumanism. All of these things are central components of what the World Economic Forum are advocates for, but also lobbies for. And for most people, they don't see the connection between these huge, effectively bargaining clubs, which have much more power than governments. The technology of the world has done great things, but if it lacks ethics and it lacks regulation, then it can be untethered, and it can create situations like we're experiencing now, where human rights, individual liberties can come at the cost of technological progress rather, and financial gain that comes from all of this. Because I said on my recent podcast, you'd have to be blind or ignorant to think, and I say that without judgment, it doesn't sound like it, but to not believe that money is playing a role, a significant role in what we're doing here. And I find it very hard that some of the other social movements out there, whether it's climate change or any other social movement, where they can quite clearly see the systemic issues, that these centralizations of power, the corruption and greed at the very core. They can't see it within the pandemic response, and yet they're advocating it. For my view, this accumulation of power, accumulation of wealth, corruption and greed is very much at the heart of what we're seeing here. But it's a function of this idea that the common good is directed, the moral authority is in the hands of these philanthro-capitalists, these people who have made it, and it's their duty to solve the world's problems. And this is what comes up in Winners Take All. It's like an 8-hour, if you listen to the audiobook, it's an 8-hour explanation of how people with money and power are trying to shape the world's future for the greater good, but often the greater good is at the expense of the public and at the gain of those who are enacting the change.
Yeah, look, I mean, just to add into that too, like a lot of these things sound amazing, like a lot of words that they use quite often, like build back better, for example, is a classic slogan that if you listen closely, you can hear most of the people that you're talking about refer to we're going to build it back better. And words like sustainability sounds like a word that's helping the world, but if you look deeper into what they mean by sustainability, that can be quite a concerning thing for how your future looks. And the marketing slogan of "you own nothing and be happy" is probably that's scary, just the thought of that. And this is from these big organizations. And I say to people, look, don't just take my word for it. There's a book called The Great Reset, COVID-19, The Great Reset, written by the president of there. Just go and read that book or listen to the audio book. If you go onto their website, it's all spelt out for you. So I'm just, don't shoot the messenger. So if you are confronted by hearing that for the first time, this is not Dan's opinion. This is actually in stone, in black and white writing, in books, on websites, and it's all for public to see. So thanks for your insights to that. And yeah, there is, certainly these working groups, whether it's, Agenda 21, Agenda 30, whether it's a G7 summit, they all sound like it is for the greater good, but there's always, something around there that just doesn't seem to work so well.
Well, you make a really good point, Craig. I just want to comment on that, because it's as someone who's worked in 10 years in business, I've spent a lot of time working with marketers and people who understand how to use language to persuade and influence. And this is a classic case. We live in a world now, particularly young people, because one of the things that was really surprising to me, I'd go to protests, about the lockdowns and these other different interventions, and there was so little young people there, and I think where are the students? Because usually a protest movement has its roots in kind of college students, university students who are out there pushing this thing forward, but they're just woefully absent. So I started reading into kind of the values and preferences of Gen Z, young people, Gen Y. And they really value this idea of doing things for the greater good, for the common good. But we've seen that this whole thing has been marketed in that way, so that really for them it's like this is, and people talk about virtue signaling and whatnot and this type of stuff. It falls really into that piece where it's a case of that people want to do good for each other. In the UK, we had stay at home, save lives, protect the NHS. For people, that's their mantra. It's like, I want to help save lives, I want to help protect our institutions, but you can have reasonable intent but questionable means, and that's the big difference for me. But what these companies and these influencers have learned how to do over years is how to take something at the front end, make it sound really positive, but then in the back end, as you say, it's the way in which it's done which is harmful. And if you take the time to examine the kind of things, the plans that have kind of been laid out, as you say, in the books like The Great Reset, which you can see, it's all, the theories and the plans are all kind of in plain sight. They all continue to serve the interests of those who set the plans. And that's the point. That's the point here, is that many of these institutions and NGOs and individuals, philanthropy capitalists, set out on this mission to make the world a better place. But ultimately, it's always done for self-interest. No matter how you dress it up. And at the receiving end of that is the mere mortals, us, the public. And we have to endure things like we're enduring now, where, this mentality is being used against us, really. It's been hijacked, and I think we just need to be more awake to what's happening and to see through that marketing to understand the mechanics of what's really happening. Because if we don't, then, the future of democracy, what is democracy in the modern age? It's not in our hands. The future is not in our hands as it stands. That's why at this point in time, I think it's a great opportunity for the public to recognise this is a point of change. This is a point in history where the public and the people, if they choose, have the opportunity to reclaim the power.
Yeah, and you've brought up another topic there, a little bit of a sidestep from what we're talking about now, but you mentioned protests, and totally, I was not interested in politics. As I said, I got myself out of the matrix, let's say, and I barely even knew who our premier was until last year. That's how much interest I had. But, I'm, I guess, really strong on changing our political landscape, not for me getting into politics, but me supporting, educating people to understand the importance of it. What do you see what's happened in your protests, and what have you seen on the streets? What happens there? I could certainly give you a horror story about Melbourne, Australia, the most locked down city in the world, but how's it all unfolded in the UK?
Yeah, okay. And there's something I would like to come back to that segues this two conversations in a minute that I'll come back to. But in terms of the protest movement, I've been involved in attending countless protests since this has happened. And prior to this situation, I'd never been to a protest. I'd never involved myself politically in that form of political activism. I'd been a collectivist in the past, i.e. I would share my dissatisfaction online, but I'd never taken any form of direct action in attending a protest or anything like that. Now, in the UK, it started very slowly in terms of the kind of movement. There were some small pockets of protests in the early stages of 2020. Some organisations came together to start putting on events and marches, but they were very small at the beginning. And of course, public opinion was very much that these protests were putting others at risk, which is quite futile, really, because if you actually look at the way protests are carried out, they're outdoors. It's been very clearly known since, if you look at the scientific terms, very clearly known that outdoor transmission is negligible to zero. In fact, our own SAGE group in the United Kingdom in March or April last year came out and said that, yet, didn't affect the policing of these things. It's very clear that, outdoor transmission is rarely playing a role, but people don't think in those terms. It's an emotionalized situation. So we had all these protests starting to amalgamate. Things were starting to happen. They had very negative reception. But there was a kind of tipping point in the summer last year where things really started to pop, and we'd have these massive rallies in London, which amounted up to one point, I'd say close to 1 million, if not more than 1 million people in the streets. And that's no exaggeration. We've had some of the kind of slow cameras which films the entire procession, and you kind of count, okay, if there's 10 people in a row, they're working at this speed, you can kind of reverse engineer how many people would be there. So it really amounted to these huge protests. But we've seen some really political policing. I remember being at a protest in London where there were three. And London's like the capital of protests. That you will always have different movements doing different things every weekend. If you want to go, if you're a serial protester and want to go to a protest, just go to London at the weekend. You'll find one. Something. It could be 2 people. It could be 200,000 people. But we had this huge rally. There's 50,000 people in Trafalgar Square, where there was a series of speeches from stage. And there were several other large rallies around London that weekend. Now, those other rallies, including those around Extinction Rebellion, climate change, the Black Lives Matter movements, and I'm not here to comment on the politics of those particular movements, but I am here to comment on the politics of the policing. Both of those rallies were allowed to go ahead unintervened under the same Coronavirus Act, the same regulations. There was no mention of any breach of regulation. There was no heavy-handed policing of those rallies. But this anti-lockdown rally was shut down by territorial police, riot police in their helmets with the shields, the batons raised. They seized this AV equipment and essentially, stormed this group of people. Many people knocked to the floor, several people injured. It was very aggressive policing, but ultimately it was political policing. And there's been plenty of examples of really brutal policing throughout this period of time. It's just not humane. I understand if someone is, being violent or someone is causing physical damage to property, then there is a need for the police to intervene in a slightly different way. But what we've seen here is broad stroke brutal policing at times, which of course becomes a deterrent. So the policing itself is, number one, becomes a deterrent. Now, fortunately, when you get a movement of that size, there is kind of strength in numbers, because if you get that type of policing and there's 100 of you, you're screwed. But if there's 10,000 of you or 100,000 of you, there's the strength in numbers, because there isn't enough of them to tackle people in that aggressive way. But it still becomes a deterrent, because a lot of the people that I've met at protests are, concerned parents, grandparents, who are worried for the future of humanity, worried about the future for their children. And these aren't the type of people, it's all very well being the kind of angry 20-year-old that is willing to stand in the face of a police officer, but without any discrimination here, there's others who won't want to be in that situation. They don't want to get near the police. So that's a deterrent. But then also you have the media. The media. I mean, there was one hilarious protest where I'd been to. There was a gathering of probably 20,000 people. The BBC report said 300 people gather in Parliament Square, and it's like. Yeah. Anyone that looks at any of the photos of the independent footage can see how many people were there. It does, it doesn't take a genius. But then you get all of these you labeled conspiracy theorists, far right, anti-vaxxers, all of these labels that create a perception of who these people are. Yet the reality is, Craig, through the podcast, I've interviewed countless people, and it's amazing. Some of the most shared videos I've created have been interviews at at protests. I interviewed a retired GP. I interviewed an investment banker. I interviewed a former SAS member. I interviewed senior officials from the army. I even met someone who was off duty, a police officer, who the following protest I also met again. This time he was involved in arresting one of the speakers. Yeah, he in his private life was with us. He wasn't there as undercover. He shared the same concerns. That's not to say that there are people out there who have slightly more out there views, but nonetheless, what I see is a representation of society who are concerned about the direction in which this is unfolding. And many of them are, yes, they're concerned about the policies, whether it's lockdowns or mandatory pharmaceutical interventions. But ultimately, it's bigger than that, because people are concerned about the fact that their children, the future generations, are going to have less rights and freedoms than we have growing up. And that for me is one of the reasons I continue to do what I do, because I cannot, I've just had a little baby boy, he's 5 weeks old now. I cannot face him growing up in a world where he has had less rights, freedoms, and opportunities than I have. It's unacceptable. So that's why I think more and more people are starting to now join protests. They're getting bigger and bigger because this thing is, despite the kind of virus, it's not fizzled out, but it's certainly it's causing far less problems than it was at the beginning. Yet the clampdown, in this authoritarian clampdown we're seeing is not going away. I think more and more people are seeing the risks that come with that now, whereas at the beginning people were all concerned about the risks of the virus, and now kind of people are beginning to become concerned about the risks to humanity.
Yeah, and as I said to you at the start before we went live, I said, I feel like we're on the edge of a cliff, and one of my motivators starting was, I've got 2 young children myself, and I said that if I know what I know and don't stand up, I'm impacting their future. And the worst question I could get asked in 30 years' time, hey, Dad, what did you do back in 2020? And if my response was, just watch the football, had a few beers, sat back and let all this happen, that's something that I wouldn't have been able to live with, which is what drives myself as well. So it's great to be on the same page with that. Now, when you talk about the media, we get labelled right-wing extremists and all the same words that you just used there as well. But one of the media stories that was quite often coming out here is, hey, the UK's opened up and they've got their freedoms back. Okay, everybody in Australia, we want our freedoms back. Go and race and get the injection. So that was a common narrative. Is that how has that played out? And the second question to that is, we're coming out of a flu season, which is normally winter, into our summer, but we're still buried in the same restrictions. You guys are moving from summer into the colder part. So did you get your freedoms back or just breadcrumbs? And what do you see happening going into your winter?
Well, for a start, let's take Freedom Day in the UK, 19th of July. First of all, it was delayed due to some projections that came from our scientific advisory group in the UK, which if you look at any of the projections that have been, sorry, my video's just gone fuzzy. If you look at any of the projections that the scientific advisory groups or the SPI-AM group, which is the modelling group, if you look at any of them that they've made over the course of the 18 months, 20 months that's gone preceded this, they've been woefully inaccurate. It's always worst case scenarios that don't manifest. Now, I'm someone in business that talks about, when I work with business clients, of course you want to think about the worst case scenario, so you have a plan in the eventuality of that happening, but you always expect the best. You don't live for the worst case scenario, but this is how we've been operating, and of course that leads to the fear and all the propaganda that follows around it. So we saw this new series of modelling that predicted that if we go ahead with this Freedom Day, this X amount of people are going to go to hospital, thousands of people, and of course then they delayed it a month. Nonetheless, those projections continue to unfold, and it doesn't matter how many times other scientists come out and say, look, you're out by 10-fold or 100-fold. We still give credence to these projections. But we had this Freedom Day delayed. When it finally came, on the very same day that the Freedom Day was began, where lockdowns ended and all of the most of the mandates subsided, which they did, they announced the potential rollout of vaccine passports, which to me are one of the most illiberal approaches known to humankind, where we look at a situation where we create a stratified or segregated society based upon your medical choices. Now, if you look in history at any government which has tried to segment its society based upon any human characteristic in the past, it has ended woefully, tragically. So on Freedom Day, vaccine passports were announced. They've now gone on to start using them in Scotland. It's just been voted in Wales, which is a whole story in itself because it's the least democratic decision I've ever heard. And it looks like they're going to be coming in by proxy in England next. So these were the things that were kind of announced. So whilst, yes, the lockdown restrictions ended, that became the next lever, the arm the strong arm to drive home the immunization campaign, and I've never seen anything quite like it. I actually downloaded the kind of the ethics of medical advertising, because I thought surely this is illegal. Surely, because I mean, I've done some work with clients in the health and fitness industry. It's almost impossible to get an advert approved on Facebook for anything that's health related, where you promise any form of health benefit. Yet here we are, seeing this egregious campaign, which is just glorifying this immunization campaign without, but yet simultaneously censoring any of the risks and literally removing any source of the internet, including official data. Even if it's just official data without commentary, it's taken off, which is just unbelievable. So that Freedom Day marked the beginning of a really aggressive marketing campaign for the immunization campaign, which continues to today, and we now see the introduction of the vaccine passports, but also vaccine mandates in care homes. And there's a consultation out within the government. Whenever a government puts a consultation out, it's pretty much a done deal. For the NHS, the healthcare system, to have mandatory vaccinations. It's also being potentially considered in schools, in the police, in the fire service. But we're coming into winter now, because you mentioned, Australia coming out of the winter season. We're about to go into flu season, and now we're already seeing the flu propaganda. Worst flu season in history about to come up because of lockdowns. It's like, yes, we know, we've warned you about that all the way through this, that we are going to destroy our immune systems. But again, it's be a wonderful sales tool for the same industry that has been operating so aggressively in the last few months. But yes, it's very, very difficult, because now we're going to see the care homes going into winter, because what the government doesn't seem to realize is that force doesn't drive people to making a decision. It doesn't. For a small amount of people, the cost of losing their livelihood is so great that they'll succumb to that pressure. But there are thousands of people who won't. And what that's going to do is leave care homes, which fundamentally are responsible for looking after our most vulnerable members of society, going into the harshest winter with all these extra pressures around flu and these other viruses that are inevitably going to circulate because we've lost our immune systems. We're going to leave these poor elderly underserved, and then the same is going to happen in the hospital systems. All the while we're hearing this mantra, protect the NHS, yet you're willing to cull thousands, tens of thousands of staff because they won't comply with your new vaccine mandates. So Freedom Day, yes, okay, we don't have to we're not locked down, we don't have to social distance, but half the population at least is still wearing masks, even though they're not mandatory. And we've got these terrifying mandates that really threaten our bodily autonomy. And again, for those who have studied this at length, if you look at any industry report, and if you just do it from an economic standpoint, go to one of the major industry reports on digital IDs, anything like this, you can see where the trajectory of these things are going of vaccine passports. It's no conspiracy theory. It's been written about for years, and there's companies spending millions in developing these tools and technologies. So freedom has taken on a different definition, Craig, and there are many of us out there who are protesting to fight for that freedom, because our forebearers, our ancestors, have fought hard to win these freedoms for us, and it's down to the citizens of today to defend them, because our freedoms do not need to be come as a trade-off to this illusion of safety that these mechanisms are being promoted under.
Yeah, as we do this interview, actually, people work out the date. It was announced today is Freedom Day in Sydney, and there's a lot of memes going around. It's Segregation Day, because it's actually a medical apartheid day, really effectively, for people that have complied versus the people that are hesitant and waiting. So interesting times here, and how all that's going to play out as well. In each of my episodes, I always like to give people with a bit of hope, some green shoots of excitement, and some action items that people should do. So not everyone has necessarily the courage or skills to speak up or create their own show or anything like that. But what are some important things that you think people should do? And you've interviewed the likes of Raina Filmic and many people. What are some of the hope that we have? Like for me in Australia, there's a really important court case that's just about to, the findings were just about to be completed. So is there any good signs of hope that you can see that are sort of coming through? Is it just mass awakening? You've let me know what you see.
Craig, I think there's a lot of green shoots of hope coming through now. when at the beginning I started this, there were some people, I've been in business for a long time, and I have people, so I have some very high profile people in my network. And when I started the podcast, I thought, what are these? I could see them in my head. I thought, what are these people going to be thinking about me doing this? But over time, they have reached out to me and said, thank goodness you're doing what you're doing. I'm in full support. But going beyond that now, a lot of business leaders, a lot of people from all segments of society are now raising up to say we need to do something about this. We're seeing people from all parts of society, whereas beginning it was just very much a grassroots movement. Now we're seeing policymakers, influencers joining the cause. I think you can take some faith that is happening, but we've all got to play our part. We've got to be able to have eye to eye, belly to belly conversations with our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues to say, look, something doesn't feel right about what we're going through here. I'm concerned that whilst we've been through this problem for the last 18 months, what is the future going to look like if we continue this way? Do you think there's a better way that we can handle this? Because it's down to each of us, because a lot of people are kind of looking for heroes, I think, in this time. But we all have to be our own heroes. And I think this for me, it feels like the world has gone full circle in my own personal world, Craig. I don't, it's the same for you. In the last decade, I've been working on personal empowerment and helping people to kind of transform the quality of their own mindset and the quality of their lives. Which I've deviated from for the last 18 months through this pandemic stuff. But now it feels like now is the time for people to become empowered and to recognize their own personal power so that they can have the courage to speak up about the things they care about in the world and to realize that no matter how big the problem is external to you or in your own life, you have the power to change it. You do have the power to change it. Not any one of us individually can change the law. But when we work together with others, when we come together with our communities, then we can create change. And I do believe that some of the specifics that we're facing right now, the individual laws and mandates that are really, really challenging, we can overcome those things. But more broadly, over the next few years, I think it's really important we look at some of those mechanics, some of the driving forces, and actually look at how we can actually take that kind of great awakening that's happening within society right now and almost go through what I call a de-industrial revolution and actually disconnect from the matrix, as you call it, to come out of that world and actually become captains of our own destiny and start to forge and co-create a better world for our children. Because I don't believe the trajectory we're on right now is the best form, but there's no alternative. So the great news is it's down to us to create that alternative, and the power is in our hands to do that.
Yeah, and you just to wrap this up, you mentioned the word great awakening. Define what the great awakening is for you, and is it simply just raising awareness to save humanity? Is it as simple as that?
I think the definition of great awakening is different person to person. For me, when I look at this, I think this is the kind of what I would describe. I'm not necessarily a religious person, but someone who's spiritual in some sense. I think there's an opportunity here for humanity to come back to its kind of roots in the sense of its connection to each other and the world that we live in. I think we would not see the policies that we've seen over the last 18 months if the world it prioritized the value of love and compassion, for instance, because everything that we've seen in the last 18 months has been driven out of fear and scarcity. So to me, an awakening is coming back to those higher values. It's coming back to that kind of spiritual dimension of what it means to be human and what it means to be part of a community that works together to create change. But it's also an awakening to some of those systemic challenges. When you realize how corrupt governments are and how much influence things like the World Economic Forum have upon the world, recognizing these pillars of power and how much how little control the public have at this point, or at least the perceived control, but how quickly that can change when one becomes awakened to what's happening in the world, and one becomes awakened to their own personal power, and one becomes awakened to the difference that they can make in their communities. Because once you start to create a ripple, that ripple can become a wave. So for me, the Great Awakening begins within our own hearts, but when we connect those hearts together, then the Great Awakening becomes truly great, because the communities that form are the ones that can drive the future in a much more positive direction.
Well said. And I've had a number of conversations where, for me, I've been very aware of what's been going on since 2007, but people that have this event has been the thing that's woken them up to a point where they'll never turn back. They're literally like, I'll never trust, the government again. I'll be asking more questions every single time something happens now. That I can't believe I used to follow the media and the media stories. They're done, so there is a lot of people that do fit into that category that I've certainly connected with along the journey. So from me, I want to thank you for taking the time, jumping on the show. It's always good to talk to people that, doing their bit to, I guess, contribute to this great awakening. And you've got an incredible podcast. Just one last thing, you've got your Together Declaration. I'd be amiss if I didn't bring that up. You're something you're doing for the world there as well.
Yeah, so the Together Declaration, you can see the banner behind me. I'm a founding signatory of this important declaration. This was created off the back of the announcement of the vaccine passports. It stands against this idea of segregation. The premise behind it is that together we can create change, and that together society is more prosperous. We don't want to see any of the inequalities that we've already got in our society growing through these vaccine passports. We don't want to see people discriminated against. We want people to have free choice when it comes to their medical decisions. So the Together Declaration is really a plea to society to stand up for a free and open society. And that we believe that we can transcend everything that's gone before us more effectively if we do it together. We leave no one behind. That means we do not segregate. We do not allow these mandates to come forward. We encourage businesses to open their doors to all people. So this declaration has been a really positive shoot that we've seen, one of these grassroots shoots that we've seen in the UK, but we are going to be looking to expand it internationally. We've had lots of signatories from across the world and lots of requests actually from Australia, New Zealand, France, Italy, Spain, South Africa, different countries around the world saying we want to take this into our own country because we're all facing this together. And I think that's the point now. A lot of the things we're facing are not exclusive to our own nations. This is a global situation, and I do believe when we do come together as citizens across the world to say no to this mission creep that's coming in with these vaccine passports and mandates that are similar to this, then we can overturn these things, and we can come together to reunite and say, look, we're gonna heal from this. We're gonna recover, but we're gonna do it together.
On that note, thanks for jumping on the show, Dan.
My pleasure. Thank you, Craig.